now is Volkan Sevilgen. He is the co-founder and chief technological officer at Temblor, a catastrophe modeling company specializing in seismic hazard and risk assessment based in San Francisco. Volkan, thanks so much for speaking to us here on TRT World. Now, it looks like the magnitude 7.8 earthquake, the first one, ruptured in multiple segments. But what exactly does that mean, and how did it affect the 7.5 magnitude quake that took place hours later?
Very good question. So the multiple rupture of the first event that created the stress deformation zones, which ultimately triggered the magnitude 7.5 earthquake about 100 kilometers away from the original rupture.
So have we ever seen multiple ruptures like this before? And how do seismic risk maps account for these multiple rupture scenarios?
Yes, we have. One of the most striking examples of that was 2016 Kaikoura earthquake in New Zealand. This is where 40 or 45 little segments, little fault segments merged up to create a magnitude 7.8 earthquake like what we had in Turkey. So episodes like that are now unfortunately not that uncommon. And that puts in the question about the current seismic hazard analysis strategies, which solely depends on naming the faults, measuring their lengths, assigning maximum earthquake that can occur on those faults, and quite frankly, in most cases, ignoring the possibility of faults merging up to a larger ruptures.
When you talk about seismic hazard strategies, these particular earthquakes that took place on the 6th of February, the depth of the earthquake, I understand, was not very deep. It was about 18 kilometers. How does that factor into how powerful the earthquakes are and the effect that they had, the very disastrous and deadly effects that have played out over these last 2 weeks?
Of course, shallower the earthquake, larger the shaking. That really is that simple, because you are closer to the source, and also you are essentially closer to higher frequency source, as higher frequency seismic waves attenuate faster than the low frequency ones, which could be an issue for especially short structures.
And there have also been thousands of aftershocks since the two initial earthquakes. How long are these aftershocks expected to last? And are they likely to drop in magnitude over time?
Another great question. So the earthquake magnitudes won't drop in the aftershock sequence. Their numbers, their count would decay rapidly. So just to give you a ballpark example, we are now having same amount of earthquakes in the very first day in the next 10 days. And then following 100 days, we will have about the same number of earthquakes if there's no change in the ground. And the main issue there is, even though they become quite rare in terms of numbers, their magnitude doesn't drop. So we could really have large aftershock years after.
Yeah, so that's very concerning for the people obviously living there, but also then in the rebuilding process that is expected to start within the next few weeks. And from what we've learned about what happened on the East Anatolian fault, does this give us any more insight into the North Anatolian fault, which is closer to very big cities that are highly populated, like Istanbul?
I think what we are seeing in East Anatolian fault and this large earthquake creating very large shaking, and with the current building codes, I think we have to wait a little bit before we start rebuilding buildings that are may or may not be adequate in terms of building codes, because in many countries, after very large earthquakes, building codes change. That's normal. So I think before we start rebuilding rapidly for the areas that could have large earthquakes, and potentially the current code may or may not be adequate for these new structures. So we don't want to be in the same situation again. Our new buildings are in the hopefully better position, but damaged nevertheless. So we don't want to be in that situation, and we want to build carefully, and we built in a sense that not to um, fully collapse, but fully function afterwards. So the buildings has to be occupiable right after earthquakes, because in a situation like this where many people lose their homes, the disaster is not just rebuilding that structure. You are really creating incredible demand on the system, and so you won't be able to build these structures in a very short period of time.
So, Volkan, from what you know about the current building codes in Turkey, which were changed after the big earthquake in 1999 that affected much of Western Turkey, how do they have to change now after these two massive earthquakes before that building restarts? And how can they be improved?
So two things. One of them is there are some instances. It looks like in our preliminary data and others, it looks like the shaking exceeded what building code required buildings to build the buildings to stand for. In other words, the observed shaking from this event was larger than code foresaw. And that's a problem, because that means even if the buildings were built to the code, they would have more damage than what they should have in a stringent code requirement. So that's problem number one. And the second problem is the building codes in general in the world, they are all essentially influenced by the US and California building codes, which uh, seeks for life safety. Life safety, I mean, buildings would it would be okay for building to be damaged to the point that it won't be able to be reused, but it won't collapse to cause fatalities. Well, that's a very, very low bar if you think about it. Because, yes, it might be okay for a single building to be rebuilt after an event, but when you have 50,000 heavily damaged buildings that needs to be rebuilt, that's a very, very difficult problem. And there are a lot of examples, even in this earthquake, many hospitals that's been base isolated performed extremely well, and they were functional during and after earthquake. And that's a very good example that we need to uh, repeat and build the buildings in a way that we will be able to use it again, so we don't live in these one earthquake buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to be taken into consideration now in this building process. Volkan, really appreciate you taking out the time to talk to us and explain that so well. Thank you so much.